For more than 6 decades, Paul McCartney has represented one of the most melodic and disciplined traditions in popular music. Ozzy Osbourne, by contrast, became a symbol of heavy metal's darker theatricality and emotional intensity. On the surface, they seem to belong to entirely different musical universes. One is associated with harmony, structure, and optimism, the other with distortion, confrontation, and spectacle. Yet music history is rarely as divided as it appears. Beneath the stylistic contrasts lies a quieter story about influence, respect, and the invisible threads that connect artists across genres. This documentary explores that connection, not through rumor or dramatization, but through documented interviews, public statements, and the cultural context that shaped both men. Rather than asking why they did not collaborate, it may be more meaningful to ask what their distance represents. Sometimes the most powerful relationships in music are not partnerships sealed in a studio, but parallel journeys that unfold side by side. In understanding those parallel journeys, we begin to see how two seemingly opposite figures helped define the same musical era. Ozzy Osbourne grew up in Aston, Birmingham, during a period when economic hardship shaped daily life. For many young people in post-war Britain, opportunity felt limited and futures seemed predetermined. Music, especially the explosion of British rock in the 1960s, offered something radically different: possibility. Ozzy has often spoken in interviews about the profound impact the Beatles had on him as a teenager. Hearing their songs on the radio was not simply entertainment, it represented escape. The Beatles demonstrated that working-class boys from England could transform their circumstances through creativity. For Ozzy, that realization was formative. It did not push him toward imitating their sound, but it did expand his sense of what life could become. Inspiration does not always produce resemblance. Sometimes it simply unlocks imagination. In that sense, the Beatles, and by extension Paul McCartney, played an indirect but meaningful role in shaping Ozzy's early vision of himself. This influence would remain part of his story, even as his musical path moved in a far heavier direction. When Black Sabbath emerged at the end of the 1960s, they introduced a sound that contrasted sharply with the melodic optimism often associated with the Beatles. Sabbath's music was darker, slower, and more ominous. It reflected industrial landscapes and social anxiety rather than youthful romance. Yet both bands were products of the same broader cultural shift. British rock was evolving, and artists were exploring new emotional territories. While McCartney refined songwriting craft and studio innovation, Ozzy and his bandmates were redefining the emotional vocabulary of rock music. Instead of harmony-driven pop structures, Sabbath leaned into tension and atmosphere. Still, it is important to recognize that influence can be foundational without being stylistically visible. The confidence to experiment, to build a band, and to believe in a global audience had already been modeled by groups like the Beatles. In this way, the contrast between McCartney and Ozzy is not a contradiction. It is a demonstration of how one generation of artists opens doors that the next generation walks through in unexpected ways. Over the decades, Ozzy Osbourne publicly acknowledged the Beatles' importance in his life. In interviews, he described the moment he first heard their music as transformative. That honesty was notable because Ozzy's public persona often emphasized rebellion and irreverence. Yet when speaking about the Beatles, his tone shifted toward gratitude. He did not frame them as competitors or distant icons. Instead, he credited them as proof that change was possible. This distinction matters. Admiration does not require imitation. Ozzy did not attempt to replicate McCartney's melodic sensibility, nor did he soften his style to align with it. Instead, he internalized the broader lesson: music could alter destiny. In cultural history, such acknowledgments are powerful because they reveal the hidden architecture of influence. Fans often focus on sound, but artists frequently speak about mindset. For Ozzy, the Beatles represented courage and possibility. That acknowledgement created an invisible bridge between two musical worlds that otherwise appeared miles apart. Paul McCartney, for his part, has always been selective about collaborations. Throughout his post-Beatles career, he has worked across genres, but his choices often reflect comfort with melodic structure and songwriting tradition. Heavy metal, especially in its rawest forms, operates with different priorities. Its emotional intensity and sonic aggression can feel distant from McCartney's artistic identity. That difference does not imply judgment. It reflects artistic boundaries. Every musician develops an internal compass shaped by upbringing, training, and instinct. McCartney's compass has consistently pointed toward melody, arrangement, and lyrical clarity. When discussions surfaced over the years about potential cross-genre collaborations in rock history, fans sometimes imagined what a McCartney and Ozzy partnership might sound like. Yet speculation often overlooks authenticity. Collaboration is not merely about novelty. It requires genuine alignment. The absence of a joint project between them may therefore say less about rejection and more about artistic self-knowledge. There have been accounts suggesting that Ozzy once expressed interest in working with Paul McCartney. In interviews, Ozzy spoke openly about how meaningful it would have been simply to share a musical moment. Importantly, he often discussed this with humor rather than frustration. That tone is significant. It suggests that admiration was the driving force, not ambition. Ozzy did not present the idea as a strategic move for commercial gain. Instead, he framed it as symbolic, an acknowledgement of influence coming full circle. Public conversations about potential collaborations can sometimes be exaggerated by media headlines, but Ozzy's own words tended to be self-aware. He recognized that their musical styles were far apart. What he seemed to value was not a chart-topping duet, but a gesture of connection. In music history, symbolic gestures often matter more to artists than audiences realize. It is equally important to understand McCartney's perspective within the broader arc of his career. After the Beatles, he faced intense scrutiny and pressure to prove himself repeatedly. His solo projects and work with Wings demonstrated both experimentation and adherence to his melodic roots. Over time, McCartney cultivated a reputation for consistency. He rarely entered collaborations that felt stylistically disconnected from his own musical language. From a professional standpoint, such caution can be interpreted as discipline. Artists who endure for decades often protect the integrity of their sound. That does not prevent them from appreciating other genres. Appreciation and participation are different decisions. The absence of collaboration between McCartney and Ozzy may therefore reflect two artists honoring their distinct creative paths rather than failing to find common ground. As Ozzy's career progressed, his image evolved from controversial frontman to elder statesman of heavy metal. Public perception often emphasizes spectacle, but longevity tells a deeper story. Remaining relevant across decades requires adaptability and resilience. In interviews later in life, Ozzy's reflections often carried a tone of humility. He spoke about survival, gratitude, and the unexpected turns of his career. Within those reflections, his respect for the Beatles remained consistent. That continuity highlights how early inspiration can endure even as style changes dramatically. For cultural historians, such consistency reveals something profound. Influence is not erased by reinvention. It becomes part of an artist's internal framework. The later years of Ozzy Osbourne's life were marked by health challenges that he addressed publicly. He discussed medical issues with candor, allowing fans to see a more vulnerable side of a figure long associated with intensity. This transparency reshaped how many people understood him. Rather than a distant rock icon, he appeared as a human being navigating physical limitations while honoring a lifetime of work. Public conversations about his health also sparked renewed appreciation for his resilience. In these moments, the narrative shifted from spectacle to substance. It became less about shock value and more about endurance. That reframing echoes a broader theme in music history. Artists are often reduced to personas, but time reveals the person behind them. When cultural figures reflect on one another late in life, their words often carry special weight. Even brief acknowledgments can reshape how audiences interpret decades of parallel history. McCartney has spoken respectfully about many fellow musicians across genres, emphasizing shared dedication rather than stylistic difference. While there is no widely documented dramatic exchange between him and Ozzy, the absence of conflict is itself telling. In an industry frequently fueled by rivalry narratives, quiet mutual respect can be more meaningful than headline-grabbing collaboration. Sometimes the strongest statements are understated. The idea that two artists must collaborate to validate one another is largely a modern expectation. In reality, music history is filled with parallel careers that influenced each other indirectly. The Beatles and Black Sabbath helped define different emotional registers within rock. Together, they expanded its boundaries. McCartney refined melodic craftsmanship. Ozzy embodied raw expression. Both contributions are essential to understanding the genre's evolution. Their coexistence demonstrates that musical progress does not depend on uniformity. It thrives on diversity. From a documentary perspective, examining their connection invites reflection on how influence travels. It is rarely linear. A young listener hears a song, internalizes its possibility, and later transforms that inspiration into something entirely new. Ozzy's acknowledgement of the Beatles fits this pattern. He did not replicate their formula. He reinterpreted their message of transformation. McCartney's legacy, therefore, extends beyond sound into cultural permission. The idea that ordinary beginnings do not limit extraordinary outcomes. Equally compelling is the way audiences construct narratives around artists. Fans often imagine hidden rivalries or missed opportunities, filling gaps with speculation. Yet available interviews and public statements suggest something simpler: respect without convergence. That simplicity may feel less dramatic, but it is historically more accurate. Understanding this distinction is important in an era where viral storytelling can blur fact and fiction. Responsible music analysis values documented evidence over emotional embellishment. The absence of a recorded collaboration between McCartney and Ozzy does not diminish either legacy. In fact, it may preserve the clarity of their individual identities. Cross-genre projects can be powerful, but they can also dilute distinctive voices. By remaining in their respective lanes, both artists maintained authenticity. That authenticity is a key factor in their longevity. Audiences respond to sincerity, even when styles differ dramatically. Another dimension worth considering is generational symbolism. The Beatles represented a cultural awakening in the 1960s. Black Sabbath channeled the anxieties of a changing industrial society. Each reflected its moment. Together, they illustrate how rock music matured, from youthful exuberance to darker introspection. McCartney and Ozzy became symbols of these phases. Their parallel prominence reveals how one genre can contain multitudes. As time passes, artists increasingly become historical figures rather than contemporary celebrities. Their interactions, whether documented or imagined, take on mythic qualities. It is therefore important to separate verified history from narrative embellishment. What is verifiable is Ozzy's admiration for the Beatles and McCartney's consistent emphasis on artistic authenticity. These documented elements provide enough substance without requiring dramatic additions. The human dimension of this story lies in gratitude. Ozzy repeatedly expressed thankfulness for the music that inspired him. Gratitude is often overlooked in rock narratives that focus on rebellion, yet it is a powerful creative force. Recognizing those who opened doors does not weaken individuality, it strengthens it. In acknowledging the Beatles, Ozzy highlighted continuity within musical evolution. For McCartney, maintaining artistic boundaries has been part of his longevity strategy. Not every opportunity aligns with personal vision. Declining a collaboration can reflect self-awareness rather than dismissal. In creative fields, discernment is as important as openness. This perspective reframes any unfulfilled collaboration not as a missed chance, but as a deliberate preservation of identity. Ultimately, the relationship between Paul McCartney and Ozzy Osbourne illustrates how influence and independence coexist. One artist can profoundly shape another's life without sharing a studio. Respect can exist without spectacle. In a media landscape that often demands dramatic narratives, their story offers something quieter but equally meaningful: acknowledgement across difference. So did Paul McCartney wait too long to express admiration, or was restraint itself a form of respect? The documented record suggests that both men understood the value of authenticity. They walked separate paths, occasionally intersecting in acknowledgement rather than collaboration. Perhaps that was enough. Their legacies remain distinct yet interconnected, proof that music history is not a single melody, but a vast arrangement of contrasting harmonies. If this perspective deepened your understanding of their impact, consider sharing your thoughts and continuing the conversation about how artists influence one another across generations.